Almost from the beginning of the war against Japan, Allied military leaders were divided in their opinions as to the best way to defeat the enemy. The British favoured a holding action until the Germans were conquered. The Americans insisted that some offensive action must begin early to keep the Japanese from continued expansion. At the end of March 1942, the American Joint Chiefs of Staff divided the Pacific War Zone into two commands: General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area and Admiral Chester Nimitz's Pacific Ocean Area. The Japanese drive against Port Moresby and the invasion of the American Aleutian Islands in the spring of 1942 convinced the British that offensive action was necessary, but it did not resolve the debate over the manner in which it was to be carried out. The Battle of Midway was a defensive effort, and the war in the Aleutians bogged down. The American invasion of the Solomons was a holding action, designed to deny the enemy an airbase on Guadalcanal, which could be used to stage bombing raids on Australia and to cut Allied communications. When it came to discussing the road back, the traditional wisdom held for a drive through the Central Pacific. That strategy had been accepted in all the American war plans since the 1920s. General MacArthur disagreed. From the moment that he landed in Australia and set up headquarters at Brisbane, he argued for a drive up through Indonesia to the Philippines. In the summer of 1942, MacArthur's army forces and Nimitz's naval forces were both ordered to remove the enemy threat in New Guinea and the Solomons, but their progress was slow and not a very convincing argument for MacArthur's island hopping. At Casablanca in Morocco in January 1943, the British and American leaders met-plan their joint war efforts for the coming months, and Admiral King argued for the Central Pacific offensive against Japan. General MacArthur was relegated to a supporting role. Diversionary was the word. The major American offensive would be conducted from Pearl Harbor into the Central Pacific, and the first target would be the Marshall Islands. These islands had been a part of the old German Empire before World War I. The Japanese had taken them and been given a mandate over them by the League of Nations. What had happened to them since was very fuzzy in the minds of the rest of the world. The Japanese had withdrawn from the League of Nations in the mid-1930s when their war policies were criticized. It was suspected that Japan had fortified the Marshalls, but so little was known about the whole area that even the naval charts had many bare spots. What was known was that the nearest of the Marshall Islands to any Allied territory was still out of range of land-based aircraft. This was the edge of the Japanese Empire. From the Marshalls, the Japanese could island hop all the way to Tokyo. If the Allies could capture the Marshalls, they would take a giant step into the Pacific. The Marshalls would provide them with a base for further assault on the inner empire, which began with the Marianas. The Joint Chiefs of Staff asked Admiral Nimitz for a plan of invasion of the Marshalls, but even as the request came in June 1943, Nimitz was thinking about invading the Gilbert Islands first. His photo reconnaissance planes had discovered an airstrip on Betio Islet at Tarawa Atoll and a seaplane base on Butaritari Islet of Makin Atoll. His Chief of Staff, Admiral Raymond Spruance, had suggested that the Marshalls would be a tough nut to crack, and that the American amphibious forces were not yet ready. Spruance wanted to invade the Gilberts. The Gilberts were better known, said Spruance, which was correct. The Gilberts had been a British possession until they had been seized by the Japanese in 1941. Reconnaissance could be carried out by land-based aircraft from the Ellis Islands, which were held by the Allies. There was another reason for Spruance's caution, aside from his innate conservatism. The only battle-tested amphibious troops were the Marines of the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions. Also, the Pacific forces had but one experience in landing and supply of invading forces, at Guadalcanal. The conditions there were considerably different from anything that would be faced in an invasion of the Central Pacific. At Guadalcanal, the Americans had been backed by service bases in the New Hebrides and New Caledonia island chains, not far from the scene of action. When the Marshalls' invasion was undertaken, and it would be Spruance who would do the job, there would be no land-based air support from these islands and Australia. Admiral Turner would come up from the South Pacific to direct this new invasion, but by the summer of 1943 he had not come yet, nor did the Central Pacific forces even have a troop commander. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were asking for an invasion within a few months, and so Admiral Spruance was certain that the Marshal's invasion was too ambitious, and that it would be far better to pick a softer target than the Marshals for the first effort. Admiral Spruance had convinced Nimitz, and he in turn convinced the Joint Chiefs of Staff, partly with his argument about the air bases in the Gilberts, which could harry the invaders of the Marshals if not first neutralized. So the Gilberts had come first as a learning operation. The lesson was costly and bitter. At the end, it was obvious that Spruance had been dead right. They needed a learning operation. It was only too bad that they had chosen Tarawa, one of the most fiercely defended atolls in the Pacific. And that was a serious error in calculation of the tides that had left hundreds of Marines out in shallow water to brave the interlocking fields of fire from the defenders as they tried to wade into shore on Little Betio Islet. As a result of this error and the stubbornness of the Japanese defenders, nearly 1,000 Marines lost their lives. Further, the Americans had made the mistake of attacking a group to which they had pointed the way 15 months earlier. In August 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's 2nd Marine Raider Battalion had made an attack on Butaritari in the Makin Atoll. After the raid, the Japanese set about fortifying the Gilberts, and when the Marines came again, they were ready for them. But on the positive side, the Marines and the Navy had learned quickly. General Smith had fought like a tiger to secure the use of amphibious landing craft, which Admiral Turner had said were unnecessary. Turner had learned that without amphibious craft, they might have lost the battle. He had learned that the bombardment of shore installations must be longer and more thorough than the Gilberts barrage had been. He had learned that the escort carriers used to support the troops must have better night protection. The light carrier Independence had taken a torpedo just before sunset on D-Day, and the escort carrier Liscombe Bay had been sunk by a torpedo 4 days later. The first torpedo had been delivered by a bomber, the second by a submarine, both at times when light and darkness were merging. This sort of attack was to be commonplace throughout the rest of the war. Tarawa had brought about an enormous outcry in America because of the casualties. The military leaders knew, but could not say, that the campaign has to be costly, but that was the stark fact. There was no way for the Americans to learn how to storm Japanese defences until they had tried. By choosing the Gilberts, they had driven a wedge deep into the lines of communication of the Japanese at Truk and in the southern islands. 20 years later, historians could prove that the Gilberts operation might have been eliminated and the first landing staged in the Marshalls. Perhaps, but such speculations failed to take into consideration the reaction of the Japanese had the circumstances changed. In the winter of 1943 to 1944, Nimitz and his commanders were too busy for speculation. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were already pressing the Navy to take the Marshalls and the Carolines, for use as the base of the assault against the inner Japanese Empire. But to accomplish this task, Nimitz would have to capture hundreds of islands in the 3 million square mile circle of Micronesia, an effort bound to be wasteful in men and equipment. It was not necessary, Nimitz insisted. Eniwetok, the principal atoll in the Marshalls, held one of the best ports in the Pacific. That was what was needed for the future build-up. Nimitz was receptive to the requests of Admiral Turner and the demands of General Holland Smith for change. Turner expected the Japanese to build up Eniwetok's and Kwajalein's defences after the fall of the Gilberts. To offset this expected action, he wanted constant observation by land-based aircraft and constant bombing by land-based aircraft and carriers. Mullenix Field, named for the admiral who had gone down with the Liscombe Bay, was built on Buota. The Navy built up the Betio airstrip too. Soon daily observation and bombing flights began against the Marshalls. General Smith wanted longer naval bombardment by 2 or 3 days, more airstrikes and better air support. To achieve this latter, he proposed that a Marine air wing be assigned to the escort carriers so that the troops ashore could be assured of air support from pilots who knew their problems. He also insisted that all amphibious divisions should be equipped with amphibious vehicles capable of bringing troops, tanks and guns in over the shallows and reefs he expected to find in the future landings, 500 such craft to each division. That change would make sure that the first ghastly mistake of Tarawa was not repeated. In the Gilberts invasion, Major General Holland Smith had been assigned the Army's 27th Division to attack Macon. From the beginning, he had been unhappy about the choice. He had no administrative control over that division, which meant he did not supervise its training for amphibious combat. Since Smith's job just before he came to the Pacific had been Chief Training Officer on the West Coast for the Marines, he knew as much about amphibious warfare as anyone else in the United States. The Army knew virtually nothing, but the 27th Division was trained by the Army under Lieutenant General Robert C. Richardson, commander of Army troops in Hawaii. Richardson wanted Holland Smith's job, and that did not make things any easier from the beginning. Holland Smith laid out the plans for the operation and handed those for the 27th Division to the Army. General Richardson then decorated his staff for the massive planning they had done. In the invasion, Holland Smith had been disgusted with the slow movement and incompetence of the 27th Division. At the end of the second day, against light opposition, they had still failed to take the airfield and link their two invading groups. Holland Smith came ashore. He spent the night at Ralph Smith's command post and felt lucky to be alive at dawn, for the area was peppered all night by rifle fire, not from the Japanese, but from wild shooting army sentries who fired at anything that moved. Smith went back to the flagship shaken and shaking his head over the incompetence of the army. It was not the soldiers, he knew, but the training that was at fault. The second-hand notes available to the training officers in Hawaii were fragmentary. They had not covered use of tanks and other aspects. The Army had not been given Navy vessels to support their training, and as far as the Army was concerned, one of the other ghastly mistakes was to entrust the land-based operations to a Marine general. Lieutenant General Richardson, who was also the Army commander in the Central Pacific, resented the way that Howling Mad Smith had stormed ashore at Macon and berated Major General Ralph Smith, commander of the 27th Infantry Division, for his failure to move his troops. One of the reasons for the failure was a very late Army start in amphibious training. The major literature available to Ralph Smith was printed in the 1930s and early 1940s. The best information he had was a set of notes prepared by Army officers who had studied at Navy training centres. That failure was not due to oversight, but rather to the nature of the Gilberts invasion. The 2nd Marine Division, which invaded Tarawa, had received most of its training under fire in the invasions of Guadalcanal and in the invasions of other islands of the South Pacific, and that division was shipped direct to Tarawa. General Holland Smith had expected the Army to provide him with equally competent troops, and of course that had been impossible. But Holland Smith's principal objection to the Army troops of the 27th Division had been the failures of their officers. This objection was not forgiven by General Ralph Smith and General Robert Richardson. The latter was quick to congratulate Marine Major General Julian Smith and the 2nd Marines on their efficient work at Tarawa. The lessons learned from our battle on Betio Island will be of greatest value to our future operations. The first of these lessons, General Richardson had soon decided, was to replace the Marine Command with an effective Army Command, and he so recommended to Admiral Chester Nimitz as the invasion of the Marshalls was in the planning stage. This recommendation was supposed to be absolutely secret. General Richardson took the precaution of preparing a for-your-eyes-only memorandum to Admiral Nimitz, asking that in future General Holland Smith's duties be restricted to straight administration of Marine troops only. The tactical command, control of the troops that would invade the islands, should be given to Richardson, and he should furnish all troops for the coining invasions. At SINCPAC headquarters, Nimitz's senior officers referred privately to General Richardson as Nervous Nelly because he was constantly worrying about problems that never developed. But this memo represented something far deeper, the perennial quarrel between the Army and the Marines over troop employment. The Navy had always used Marines as its prime shock troops, and the Army had always resented this. General Richardson shared this distaste for employment of Marines to do what he considered to be soldiers' work. His emotions were also aroused because Major General Ralph Smith was a protégé of his, dating back before the days when Richardson had commanded the Army 7th Corps and Ralph Smith had been one of his lieutenants. Howling Mad Smith's salty words about the military conduct and failures of Ralph Smith had gotten around Pearl Harbor, and this was Richardson's response. No one would ever accuse Admiral Nimitz of violating confidence, but within a matter of hours, the contents of the Richardson Memorandum were known within the SINCPAC staff. The naval officers were more or less amused at Richardson's gall, but the Marines were furious. Fortunately for Army-Navy relations, very little of the 27th Division would be employed in the Marshall's invasion. That decision was made months before the Smith versus Smith controversy began. While the men of the 27th Division were in action, men of the 7th Division's 17th and 32nd Regimental Combat Teams were preparing for the Marshall's invasion. These were the only troops of the 7th Division that had been in previous combat, the Aleutians. They led in the training of all the other troops of the 7th and the 27th's 106th Infantry Regiment, which would be the Army forces involved in the Marshall's invasion. The Marine forces would be the 4th Marine Division and the 22nd Marine Regimental Combat Team. The invasion of the Gilbert Islands was completed by the end of November 1943, and the fighting troops were replaced by garrison forces. Within the week, an airstrike was made by the new fast carrier force that had been building in the Pacific over the past few months. Task Force 50, as it was called, was commanded by Rear Admiral Charles A. Pownall. It consisted of 4 new Essex-class fleet carriers, the Enterprise, which was sturdy if not so new, the Saratoga, for which the naval word was venerable, and 5 of the new light carriers. Task Force 50 was divided into 4 groups, each commanded by a Rear Admiral. It was the most powerful naval air force afloat anywhere in the world, and superior to the Japanese carrier group for the first time. 2 of the carrier groups, Admiral Arthur Radford's and Admiral Frederick Sherman's, were in need of repairs and supply. At the end of the Gilberts battle, Sherman's Princeton, for example, was suffering from vibration in her propulsion system that had been exacerbated by 10,000 miles of continual steaming in the past few weeks. 3 helmsmen had been injured, and the engineering department was worried about more casualties. The Princeton was sent back to Pearl Harbor for repairs, first having transferred all her operational aircraft to other carriers, except those needed for patrol, and having taken aboard the war wearies damaged in the recent series of airstrikes against Japanese bases in the South and Central Pacific. To a lesser degree, the other carriers of these groups were in the same condition, so Admiral Pownall took with him his own group and that of Admiral Montgomery to strike the Marshalls. The force consisted of 6 carriers with 386 aircraft, and the 2 groups made an ocean rendezvous east of the Marshalls and took on fuel. Then, on December 1, they steered west and headed for Kwajalein Atoll in the middle of the Marshalls. About 40 miles east of the Marshall Chain, they launched planes early on the morning of December 4, surprising the Japanese, who had expected the attack to come from the south and had concentrated their air power on the west side of the island chain. The Americans came down from the north. The advantage of surprise was brief. The Japanese soon had 50 fighters in the air, and a heavy barrage of anti-aircraft fire came up, but the Japanese had obviously not expected an airstrike quite so soon, and several warships and freighters were in the various harbours. The planes came over Roy Islet in Kwajalein Atoll and strafed and bombed, but the Japanese had been extremely clever in their camouflage. They had built mock aircraft of bamboo and reeds, which they left on the runways and parking areas. They concealed all but their immediately operational aircraft in hidden revetments, often protected by heavy log walls and roofs. Consequently, although the Americans struck hard at Roy, they destroyed only 3 bombers and 16 fighters. They did not know they had left behind unhurt some 40 Japanese aircraft. The cruiser Isuzu was at anchor in the lagoon, and they attacked it, but the Isuzu managed to avoid all but 2 bombs, which knocked out her rudder. One big transport was torpedoed and blew up with a satisfying explosion that suggested she was carrying ammunition. Other planes headed for the Japanese naval base at the southern end of the atoll. At Kwajalein Atoll, they struck Kwajalein, Ebeye, and Inubuj Islands, and at the end of the strike, the American pilots reported enthusiastically on their performance as they talked to the air intelligence officers aboard their carriers. Some pilots, however, and several of the carrier captains wanted to send a second strike. That was the plan, but Admiral Pownall grew nervous here in the enemy heartland. He decided that the uncertain performance of several carriers had been caused by exhaustion. After all, the ships and planes had been in action since the early days of November. Pownall decided to cancel the second strike on Kwajalein and headed for Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, planes from the Yorktown alone launched a strike against Votja. It accomplished very little, and that failure seemed to bear out the sensibility of Admiral Pownall's decision. After all, he had no night fighters. Admiral Radford's carrier group was the only one so equipped, and he wanted to be as far out of bomber range from the Marshalls as possible by nightfall. Between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m., when the bombers were recovered and the task force steamed eastward, several Japanese planes attacked, but half a dozen of them were shot down by ship anti-aircraft guns. When the carrier captains began comparing notes, they concluded that they had sent off 246 planes against the atoll and had destroyed 55 Japanese aircraft, most of them in the air. They also claimed to have sunk 4 Japanese ships, but the 2 cruisers in the lagoon both escaped serious damage, and so did most of the merchant ships. The last plane landed and the losses counted. 5 American planes, the task force began to move. Mission completed, signalled Admiral Pownall, but aboard the carriers, the photo specialists were developing film, and the films showed what the pilots had not seen: the existence of dozens of aircraft in those camouflaged revetments and unhurt ships. Aboard the Yorktown, Captain J.J. Clark wanted to go back for another strike, for his photos showed how little he had done at Votja, but Pownall said no, they were going home, and he was in command. They left, leaving behind them many Japanese aircraft that would have to be accounted for later. As Pownall had gloomily expected, the Japanese came after them that night from all parts of the Marshalls. The snoopers showed up at dusk and remained with them. In the later hours of December 4, after the moon was high, the attacks began. The Japanese had 40 or 50 planes in the air attacking various elements of the force. The carrier Lexington took a torpedo in the stern, which killed or wounded nearly 50 men. The Lexington was attacked several more times, but Captain Felix Stump and his men saved the ship, and as the moon went down at about 1:30 on the morning of December 5, she could make 21 knots. The Japanese retired at moonset, and the task force relaxed. Next day, they were far enough offshore so that a large Japanese force that was launched from the Marshalls could not find the ships, and Task Force 50 steamed back to Pearl Harbor without further difficulty. The incidents began to occur almost immediately after the carriers were moored. Admiral Pownall went off to report on the raid to Admiral Towers, but found Towers gone to Admiral John Hoover's command at Canton Atoll in the Phoenix Islands, 1,200 miles southwest of Pearl Harbor. Among General Richardson's many complaints about the Navy's employment of Army forces was the charge that his shore-based Army bombers had been misused in the Gilberts operation. Richardson blamed the Navy. Admiral Towers blamed Admiral Spruance. Admiral Hoover blamed the Army for training its pilots to bomb from high altitude. When working in the Pacific Islands, he insisted, Norden bomb sites or not, the planes must get down on the target if they wanted to hit anything. This discussion at the Nimitz staff level had deteriorated into hot argument, and Towers had been dispatched to investigate and report to the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Forces. Towers reported back, but the Army continued in its own ways, and the problem was not solved. Admiral Pownall then sat back and waited for Towers to return, but Pownall's junior officers were not waiting. They were furious at having been called away from the Kwajalein strike because Nellie was nervous again. On the voyage back to Pearl Harbor, the air intelligence officers had pored over the blow-ups of the aerial photographs and marked up the Japanese planes they could identify in their hidden revetments. As soon as the Yorktown was safely berthed, Captain J.J. Clark rushed to SINCPAC headquarters, flourishing a handful of prints. He too found Towers gone, but he then went to the office of Rear Admiral Forrest Sherman, Nimitz's chief air officer. Sherman had recently been brought up to that post from the job as Towers' chief of staff, a recognition of Nimitz's increasing awareness of the importance of the carriers. Clark came bursting into Sherman's office that day, slapped the photographs on the desk, and began sorting them out to show what the task force had done and had not done. Sherman looked them over carefully, then got up and opened the door to the next room, where Rear Admiral C. A. McMorris was located. McMorris was Nimitz's chief of staff. "Do you want to see the fish that got away?" asked Sherman. He took McMorris into his office and showed him the pictures, as Captain Clark stood by, expecting McMorris to show his own outrage. But McMorris was more interested in the photo that showed the half-built airstrip on Kwajalein. He picked it up and took it to Colonel Ralph Robinson, the assistant plans officer. Just at that moment, Robinson was worrying over the planning of the Marshall invasion. Where should they attack? Nimitz's commanders, Spruance, Turner and Smith, all held for attacking on the perimeter of the island group. Mealy, Majuro and Malolap were most often mentioned. When McMorris took the Kwajalein photo into Admiral Nimitz, the commander-in-chief decided then and there that Kwajalein must be the focal point. Spruance did not like the idea, because after the Marshall's invasion, he was going to have to give up most of his ships to the Southwest Pacific to support MacArthur's next move. There were not enough resources to do otherwise. The deciding factor in the approval by the British-American Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Central Pacific Campaign had been Admiral King's promise that it would be carried out with resources available and would not deny the European theatre needed supply. Spruance, always the cautious man, did not like the idea of capturing a base in the heart of the Japanese-held Marshall Islands, then leaving it without a fleet to defend shipping that must come through the enemy-held atolls to reach Kwajalein. Turner and Smith agreed, but Nimitz said they must strike at the heart. Spruance would not have to worry about the fleet's absence. Land-based aircraft would protect the Marshall's bases from Japanese attack, and Spruance, Turner and Smith made one last argument. What about the Japanese air bases on the Marshall atolls of Wotje, Mealy, Malolap and Jaluit? The carriers would neutralize them, said Admiral Nimitz, proving that he was far ahead of his commanders in appreciating the enormous change that the new carriers had brought to naval warfare. If the carrier force was to succeed in neutralizing Japanese air power, it must be used aggressively, and this was the next big issue that Nimitz had to resolve. The Young Turks, the captains of the fast carriers, were complaining about Admiral Pownall's timidity in employment of the task force. Captain Clark prepared a white paper which he gave to Admiral Towers, and Towers did not tell Clark, but he agreed completely. It was necessary to move quickly if a change was to be made, so Towers went to Nimitz to suggest that Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher be given command of the fast carrier force. Admiral Forrest Sherman verified everything Towers said about the problem, and Nimitz sent a message to Admiral King asking for the change. When Admiral Spruance learned of the plan, he was upset. Pownall was just his sort of carrier commander, efficient and, above all, cautious. If Pownall was given the task of guarding an invasion force, Spruance could be sure that he would not be off chasing the Japanese fleet. He was not so sure of the new breed of airmen, which Mitcher typified, men who believed the carriers should be set free to roam the seas and knock out Japanese opposition at its sources. Spruance complained and secured Nimitz's promise that Pownall would not be replaced until after the Marshall's invasion. Perhaps, suggested Forrest Sherman, Admiral Mitcher could go along on the Marshall's operation with Pownall as an observer. Nimitz liked that idea, but events moved too quickly for it to be adopted. The Marshall's invasion was scheduled for January 31, a little over a month from the day of this discussion. It was Nimitz's habit to chew on ideas, and he worried over the problem of Pownall's command. Spruance emphasized his own conservatism by reopening the question of first invading the islands nearest Hawaii on the perimeter. He was still loath to strike at the heart and run the danger of encirclement. A reconnaissance plane that flew over Majuro Atoll saw no activity at all and was not fired on there. And when Spruance learned of that event, he went to Nimitz to again ask for an eastern base. Nimitz relented. As long as Majuro was undefended and would require no major effort, he would allow Spruance to take it as his protective base. But within a few days he gave the bad news to Pownall and to Spruance. It was not Admiral Nimitz's way to mince words, and he did not this day. He told Pownall that he had been criticized for being too timid, and he asked Pownall to put in writing what he would do in the future. Carriers, said Admiral Nimitz, must be risked. They could not damage the enemy if they did not go into his waters. Pownall's answers were not satisfactory, so by the end of the year, Nimitz had made his decision. Mark Mitcher would take over the carrier task force, Pownall would take over Admiral Towers' administrative job, and Towers would become Nimitz's deputy. More than anything that had happened to this point, these changes gave heart to the carrier men. Nimitz was showing his new concern and appreciation for the role of the carriers in the war. The original expansion of the Japanese military effort in 1941 and 1942 had given Japan control of half the Pacific Ocean, from the Aleutians on the north nearly to New Zealand on the south. This was the populous half, except for a few dots of islands in the North and Central Pacific. The only important land area in Allied hands was the Hawaiian archipelago, but by 1943 the military situation had changed. The American invasion of Guadalcanal had led to a victory in the Solomon Islands. General MacArthur had moved north to New Guinea. The campaign of attrition, as the Solomons was sometimes called, had cost the Japanese dearly in ships, in men, and especially in aircraft. The Battle of the Solomons was fought largely by the Japanese Naval Air Force, and that command lost 7,000 planes. The Naval Air Force was still primarily responsible for defence of the Empire perimeter, but its resources were shattered by the spring of 1943. The Japanese Army insisted on retaining half of all aircraft produced in the Japanese factories, although the Army was suffering virtually no losses. The Japanese General Staff, dominated by General Tojo, the Prime Minister, had no sympathy for the Navy. When the Navy asked for more planes, the request was rejected. "Let the Navy show more Bushido spirit to throw back the enemy," said the Army. In the spring of 1943, it was apparent that Bushido spirit was no substitute for ships and aircraft. The Japanese Fourth Fleet was charged with the defence of the South, but the shortage of ships and planes could not be denied. Vice Admiral Masashi Kobayashi ordered a survey of the defence possibilities. His planners advised a change in the defensive line. It would run from the tip of northern New Guinea to Truk and then up to the Marianas. This meant that the Gilberts and the Marshalls, both east of that line, would not be seriously defended. Admiral Koga, chief of the combined fleet, agreed with that plan, and it was adopted in the summer of 1943. The commanders of the garrisons in the Gilberts and the Marshalls had been told that they were expected to defend their positions to the death, and by the end of 1943, the Japanese were definitely off balance. In mid-October, the American carrier force had hit Wake, and Admiral Koga expected an invasion there. It seemed logical that the Americans would strive to retake the old captured territory. But early in November, Koga learned of the invasion of Bougainville by General MacArthur's forces and decided this was the major American thrust. Then came the carrier strike at Nauru Atoll, west of the Gilberts, and Admiral Koga realized that the Gilberts were the target for a new invasion. He decided to send reinforcements to help the garrison, but by the time they sailed from Truk and reached the Marshalls, the Gilberts were already lost. Admiral Kobayashi had moved his headquarters from Truk to Kwajalein, and the Japanese Second Fleet had sent some units to help reinforce the Gilberts. But when all was lost, the Second Fleet and the Fourth Fleet both retired to Truk. The Gilberts gone, the Marshalls would not be reinforced. Admiral Kobayashi expected the Americans to land at Jaluitor-Mili atolls in the Marshalls, and then go against the last of the Solomons, New Britain, New Guinea, and finally the Philippines. The defence line would run from New Guinea to the Palaus to the Marianas, as planned. The defence effort at the Gilberts had been a disappointment, but it would take the Americans time to assimilate their new victory, and the defenders of the Marshalls could be expected to fight bravely. Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama knew what he was to do at Kwajalein, and Rear Admiral Michiyuki Yamada, the commander at Roy, was ready too. No matter where the Americans landed, the Japanese would do their duty. They did not expect to survive the assault. For 2 weeks after the return of Task Force 50 from the Kwajalein strike, the carriers were in port at Pearl Harbor, refurbishing. The men had liberty, and the planes were inspected, tested and replaced as needed. But the Marshalls were not forgotten. The airstrips in the Gilberts were used as a staging point for heavy bombers from the South Pacific. Nearly every day, bombers and fighters struck the Marshalls. There was no question in anyone's mind, Japanese or American. The target would be the Marshalls, but the Japanese did have one question: which atoll? Mili had the largest single garrison, sitting out as it did on the southeast corner of the group. It seemed the likely candidate for invasion. But Kwajalein's 2 garrisons were also strong, and so were those at Jaluit, Maloelap, and Voce. Before the strategic planners had written off the Gilberts and Marshalls in the summer of 1943, the Marshalls' garrisons had been strengthened with army troops. There were an estimated 13,000 troops in the group, and no garrison equalled that of Tarawa. Mili had 2,500 men, and so did Eniwetok, and Kwajalein had about 5,000 on the 2 islands of Kwajalein and Roy-Namur at the opposite ends of the atoll. The Japanese had plenty of time to prepare their defences. They had begun before the Pearl Harbor attack. Originally, they had expected that an attack would come from the sea, but after the Gilberts invasion, in which the Americans had come in across the lagoon, they had moved their emphasis to the lagoon beaches, but the whole islands were prepared for defence. Once again, the blame for the defensive conditions could be traced back to the brief exploratory mission of Carlson's raiders in 1942. On balance, the Carlson raid had to be considered a disaster. For assessing it, the Japanese had created a major base at Mili, which had previously been a lookout station, and the fortifications of Kwajalein, Jaluit, Maloelap and Voce were rebuilt, and a number of airstrips completed, although the Japanese reasoning was not entirely defensive. Until the autumn of 1943, the combined headquarters in Tokyo was still planning an attack that would wipe out the American air bases in the Ellis, Fiji and Samoan island groups. Those plans were dropped when the events in the South Pacific caused Admiral Koga to shorten his defensive perimeter, and for the first time actually to abandon all thoughts of advances. If Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War, the Gilberts battle was the irrevocable proof that the war was lost. This shock could be concealed from the people at home, and was, but the Japanese strategists were under no illusions. In the Gilberts, in spite of the Koga plan to abandon that line of defence, efforts were made during the battle to reinforce the troops. A convoy was sent from Truk, but by the time it reached Eniwetok the battle was over, so the troops were added to the Marshalls' defences. That would be the last. In view of the outcome of the Gilberts invasion, no efforts would be made to save the Marshalls. In the Gilberts battle, the Japanese had sent air reinforcements, and these were lost to the defence of the Marshalls, but up from the big base at Truk came more planes to replace them. So there were still enemy aircraft on the fields for the American bombers to hit in December and January. Those attacks by land-based heavy bombers and fighters reduced the force, but in the last week of January, there were still more than 100 operational military aircraft on Japanese fields in the Marshalls. As the air attacks continued in January, Admiral Koga decided that the invasion of the Marshalls would come that month or the next. He did what he could to strengthen the defences without jeopardizing his resources. The Marshalls would be lost, but if the defenders could stall the Americans, every day meant more time for the building of defences elsewhere, and more planes coming off the assembly lines in Japan. The last reinforcements came in December. Thereafter it was a question of moving men around within the Marshalls, with the local commanders guessing which atoll would be the target. Captain Masanari Shiga on Mili was certain that his island would be hit. It was the obvious choice, since it was closest to the Gilberts. He secured 1,500 reinforcements from Rear Admiral Akiyama at Kwajalein. But after mid-December, the frequency of American air raids was such that there was no further ship movement. The truth of the situation of the Marshalls' defenders could no longer be concealed from the troops. It was made quite plain by one simple order. They were to plant and tend vegetable gardens as part of their official duties, so every man knew that there would be no more help from home. Except for inter-island radio communications and the regular daily news broadcast from the Domei station in Japan, the defenders of the Marshalls were alone. By the middle of January, as Admiral Koga had predicted, the Americans were ready to launch their invasion. The fast carrier task force was dispatched to make a series of airstrikes before the invasion, and then to support the troops. This last was Spruance's idea, and was roundly condemned by the airmen as a waste of their efforts. Mitcher and the others had an instrument more powerful than the Japanese combined fleet had been at the outbreak of the war. It consisted of 6 big fleet carriers and 6 light carriers. There were also 8 new fast battleships capable of speeds of 30 knots, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. Behind them came a fleet of oilers, repair ships, and supply ships, protected by escort carriers and destroyers. The carrier fleet could move fast, strike fast, and move again. To keep it penned up alongside an atoll supporting ground troops seemed to the airmen the height of foolishness, not only a waste of time, but a definite endangerment. If the Japanese had any aircraft and submarines, the invasion would draw them to the battle scene, and the carriers would be put at risk to no good purpose. That was the airman's argument, but Spruance was in command, and he had some support from Admiral Pownall, who would ride with Spruance in this invasion as his unofficial air advisor. Spruance insisted that the carriers protect the landings, and he would have his way this time. On January 19, Spruance avoided all further argument about use of the force by sailing in the Indianapolis for Tarawa to consult with Admiral Hoover about the use of land-based aircraft during the invasion. On January 23, Admiral Turner sailed, and the invasion was committed. 84,000 American troops were converging on the Marshall Islands to attack fewer than a quarter of their number of Japanese. On January 29, Admiral Mitcher sent his 4 carrier task groups to strike the air bases of the Marshalls. Rear Admiral J.W. Reeves' group, led by the carrier Enterprise, hit Malolap, but found very few planes there and almost all of them on the ground. His worst casualty was accidental. 2 torpedo bombers collided over Malolap and 6 men were lost. Rear Admiral A.E. Montgomery was assigned to attack Roy, one of the central positions of the Kwajalein Atoll. The Japanese had apparently guessed that Kwajalein would be attacked, for most of the fighters were located here. As the Americans came in, a squadron of Zeros went up to neutralize the combat air patrol, and when the American airstrike came in over the airfield, more Zeros appeared. But the new American F-6F Hellcat fighter plane was more than a match for the Zero. Gone were the days when that Japanese plane was the fastest and most maneuverable aircraft in the Pacific. The single greatest advantage of the F-6Fs was their armor, which protected the pilots while they hammered away at the unarmored Japanese fighters. The result was predictable. The Zeros began to go down in flames, and by 8 that morning the last fighter had been eliminated. During the invasion, no more fighter planes were launched from any point in Kwajalein Atoll. Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman's task group was virtually unopposed when it hit Kwajalein Island at the southern end of Kwajalein Atoll. Anti-aircraft fire was more disturbing, and the bombers were sent in to neutralize the guns. They knocked out some of them, and the 4th Carrier Group, led by Rear Admiral S. P. Ginder, struck the airfield at Vocha, but found little there. Most of the planes had been moved to Roy. The next day, Ginder moved on to Malolap, and then divided his time between the 2 atolls, just to make sure the Japanese did not bring any aircraft in from southern bases. By the time the troops were ready to land, the air opposition had been destroyed. There was no Japanese navy in evidence, at least on the surface, and the anti-aircraft guns had been destroyed or damaged or were keeping silent to save their efforts. Beneath the sea, the story was slightly different. The Japanese submarine Ro-39 came up as the attacks on Vocha were in progress and was ordered from Truk to take station there. Lieutenant Commander Sunao Tabata was en route to Kwajalein, filled with hope and the confidence of one important victory over the Americans. His I-175 had sunk the escort carrier Liscombe Bay off Makin in the Gilberts invasion. Now he would have a chance to try again. Rear Admiral Noboru Awada, commander of submarines at Truk, also sent Ro-40 to Kwajalein and I-11 up from the Samoa Ellis Islands Channel to take station east of the Marshalls. These were all the submarines he could spare. The others were being used to carry supplies to the beleaguered Japanese soldiers in the South Pacific Islands. The submarine men found this duty demeaning and protested as volubly as did the American carrier officers about their lot. But the Japanese Navy had an even better reason for its odd behavior. The whole Japanese war effort was dominated by the Army, and had the Navy refused this wasteful use of its weapons, the Army would have refused to supply troops to the Navy defences, and Premier General Tojo would have backed them to the hilt. The handful of submarines assigned to the Marshal's defences certainly could not change the outcome, but this was the only assistance that Admiral Koga was in a position to give at the end of January 1944. Admiral Spruance had been worried about safeguarding his line of communications until Admiral Nimitz gave him permission to take Majuro. That way ships could thread their way by the Majuro Atoll, avoiding close proximity to powerful Mealy on the south and Malolap on the north. Rear Admiral Harry Hill, one of the bright young officers Admiral Turner had brought into his expanding amphibious force, was chosen to take Majuro and then to back up the Kwajalein invasion that would be staged that same day. He carried the reserve troops that were not expected to be needed immediately. The landings on Majuro would be made by the 27th Division's troops, a reinforced battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Frederick B. Sheldon, and by the 5th Amphibious Corps Reconnaissance Company of the Marines, led by Captain James L. Jones. It was not a large force, but the absence of any activity on the island, as observed by the planes flying over in the past 2 months, indicated that there were few Japanese here. So these 1,500 troops should be enough to take the objective. The first landing was made at about 11 on the night of January 30 by Marine Lieutenant Harvey C. Weeks and a handful of men who went in by rubber boat from a fast transport. They were looking for a native to give them information, and they soon found one. The native told them there were Japanese on Darrit Island, but not anywhere else in the atoll. He said the number was about 300. Weeks and his men had landed at Catalin Island, just at the channel through the reef into the lagoon. The transport then went about 12 miles to the eastern end of the atoll and landed Captain Jones and his men on Dahlap Island. Jones encountered natives who told him all the Japanese but 4 had left the island more than a year before, and those 4 were on Majuro Island at the other side of the atoll. Meanwhile, Admiral Hill had ordered a naval bombardment of Darrit, and it had begun just after 6 on the morning of January 31. Jones got through, and the bombardment was stopped after 15 minutes. The captain sent a detachment to Darrit. The men found complete buildings, evidence of construction, and not too much damage from the gunfire. That evening, troops landed on Majuro and captured the only Japanese there, Warrant Officer Nagata of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had been left behind when the Japanese deserted the island as protector of the imperial property, which included a small store of dynamite and several machine guns. The advance base had been captured without the loss of a man, and within a few days work would be started on airstrips here. No one had expected much trouble at Majuro, although the absolute desertion of the island came as something of a surprise. But Admiral Turner and General Holland Smith expected that Kwajalein would have many of the aspects of Tarawa, with the additional complication that there were 2 objectives to be taken: Roy-Namur on the north and Kwajalein Island on the south. Kwajalein is a large atoll, more than 60 miles from end to end, but these ends were the only important points. The northern base would be attacked by Rear Admiral Richard L. Connolly's force, which included the 4th Marine Division as attack troops. The division had never been in combat and had come from San Diego for this assault. Admiral Turner commanded the Kwajalein attack force himself. Indeed, General Holland Smith complained that Turner really wanted to be a general, and that when he looked at the battle plans a few days before sailing, he found that his name was not on them, a matter he quickly rectified, for the Marines were not going to have an admiral running their show. The troops of this force were the 7th Army Division, under Major General C. H. Corlett. He and Major General Harry Schmidt of the 4th Marines would both report to General Smith once the landings were secured. The landings would be supported by Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's force of old battleships and cruisers and destroyers, which would first bombard the islands and then provide fire support for the troops on request. They, in turn, would be assisted and protected by Rear Admiral Van H. Ragsdale's escort carrier group, which would take some but not all of the responsibility from the fast carriers. 3 escort carriers were assigned to the Kwajalein landings, and 2 to Admiral Hill's Majuro landing, just in case of trouble. But since there was no trouble, the Hill force would be available. Roy-Namur was so named because there were 2 islands here, connected by a causeway built by the Japanese. Roy was almost entirely an airfield, and Namur was the defensive position where the troops lived. Nearly 21,000 Marines were in the transports, prepared to move against the 2,800 Japanese defenders. Roy-Namur housed 4 big 12.7-centimetre guns, 2 on Roy and 2 on Namur, and a number of 37mm guns, anti-aircraft guns, and smaller weapons on both islands. The Americans expected that the Marshalls would be more stoutly fortified than the Gilberts, but it was not true. There were not nearly so many guns, nor so careful a plan of firefields. A number of concrete blockhouses had been built, 3 big ones on Roy, and the machine guns were emplaced in concrete pillboxes. But the reefs were not mined, nor were anti-personnel mines buried around the islands. There was relatively little wire and only 2 major anti-tank obstacles except for ditches. Admiral Yamada had organized his defences around 7 strong points on the 2 islands, but he did not have the strength to repel 8 times as many assault troops as he had defenders. The Americans, of course, had no way of knowing the relative strength of the Japanese defences, and after the difficulties at Tarawa, General Smith was taking no chances. He wanted all the fire support the Navy would give him, but once his troops began to move, he wanted marine guns to support them too. So the plan called for the preliminary capture of 4 little islands around Roy-Namur: Melu, Enyubing, Enyumene, and Enyubir. A battalion of marine artillery would then be brought to each island, and from 4 angles they could concentrate their guns anywhere they might be needed. At 5:35 on the morning of January 31, the ships of Admiral Connolly's invasion force were in place off the Atoll. The battleship Maryland began the shelling a few minutes later, and other ships joined in. The bombardment continued for more than an hour, then was let up so that planes of the escort carriers could make a strike. That completed, the ship's guns began booming once again. The landing craft were hampered by unfavourable wind and heavy seas, and they milled about for 2 hours, and several amphibious vehicles were swamped. When they came into the islands, they were preceded by a wave of landing craft that had been fitted with rockets, and these vessels delivered a final barrage on the beaches. Craft carrying tanks then came up, and the tanks began shelling the beaches with their 37mm guns. Then the troops landed. They stormed ashore and began inching forward, but there was little need to inch because Melu held 19 Japanese, and Enyubing held 16. Most of them were killed, a few were captured. The Marines then turned to Enyumene and Enyubir.